Commissioner Conlon will lead the question. I'd like to start with just one issue you raised about the TRC helping this country to address historical wrongs, especially ones committed by the Drury Party that was in leadership for over a century. And you had a reference to not only human rights crimes, but most especially economic crimes who have been committed over this period. We heard a number of suggestions in terms of removing the names of people who especially the former Chief Justice, who on record have made some bad legal decisions, and that the names should be removed from public institutions and out of the public spotlight. Are there other recommendations or suggestions you may have, or ideas on how can a nation at this time proceed to addressing those historical wrongs?
Also, I think apology is always nice. In regard to the American scene, for instance, where there's been talks and issues about reparation and just even getting a public apology from the president, of course, President Bush refused to give a public apology for slavery. But I think that's a place to start with. And also, I think the whole idea of reparations, but not reparations in terms of money, but in terms of resources, in terms of development, in terms of things that can be given to various communities, educational centers, grants of aid, and different things according to what the people think some of their priorities are. Because there's been a disconnect in the sense that you have several groups who have been disadvantaged over a long period of time, and we're not able to benefit from development and a lot of things that are taking place in the city. And I think it's never too late to address some of those issues. I'm not sure what kind of mechanism that you come up with that will meet the needs and satisfy what the past wrongs have been, but I think at least an attempt should be made to address some of those concerns.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Conlon?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For me, I don't have much question. One question, except in your recommendation, and I need a clarification on that. You said that the TRC on page 11, lastly, the TRC should recommend as government officials with the most heinous economic and political crimes against the Liberian people are persecuted. I think we may prosecute it.
Would you run that by me again, please?
You have the persecuted instead of prosecuted.
Okay, yes.
You mean?
Yes.
Okay. And why you limited this to past official government?
No, I think it should be to all issues, not just to those things where once I think there's other issues that can be identified, things that needs to be addressed. But I think also there's the idea of justice. People talk about a lot of different kinds of things, but I haven't seen people talking much about dealing with the issues of political justice, economic justice, social justice, and I think that has to be a part of any kind of road that leads towards reconciliation, because I think that's a very important component. Now the question is how you define what justice is. What is, political, social, economic justice? Of course, that has to be defined by the people who have been victimized in terms of what it means to them.
You also mentioned on page 3, the second paragraph of your paper, that at first the American-Liberians regarded both the recaptured and the local Africans as agents and savages.
Yes, that was in the very beginning.
You say at first, but was there any time during the history of Liberia that mentality would change?
Yes, it did. It changed about 50 years after the initial contact, and when the two groups become very closely later on identified as being one and the same.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Holloway, for your presentation. The work submitted to the TRC provided a lot of information in regards to the nation past. But my question will be based on some of your publications. When Commissioner Bull read this morning, she did mention a series of publications that you did. And one of them talked about the background of Liberian Tottenham legacy. Can you throw some light on that, even though it was not mentioned in this presentation?
Yes, that was an article I did as a graduate student when I was finishing, and I was working for the school newspaper, and I was I guess it was the NOMO, and I was the editor. I did an essay looking at the significance of Tubman, what I thought that change would mean with his death, what would come forth, what would be some future projections of what I thought would happen in Liberia, and basically my conclusion was that there would be a period of instability, and probably and also the chaos that ensued. Because for some reason it seemed to me that Tubman, being the person he was and being as shrewd as he was in politics, I just didn't see Talbert as having that kind of fortitude, and I thought that there would be trouble down the way. So it was an article looking at what Tubman had done, talked about the unification program, his unity program, talk about some of his negatives, and then trying to give a projection for what I thought would occur in the future. Now this is unusual for a historian, because generally we don't like to venture in that direction. We pretty much like to deal with the past and look at data and documents and go back and interpret them. But it was a different kind of article that was saying what's next for Liberia, and I was sort of giving a projection of what I thought was going to happen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And then you talk about the unification policy, Tottenham unification policy. This is something I've always been wondering about. How does the dates affect the life of the people at the time?
Well, I think really what was happening with Tubman, as they were moving towards the era of independence, newly independent African countries all around him, and I think he felt the need to make Liberia look more African, given this new reality. But at the same time, I think he was very concerned and felt threatened that this wave of independence, African nationalism, would spread to the locals and would present a serious problem for the Americo-Liberians. So I think what he did, he was skillful in what he did. I think he puts up an issue of unity, national unity, calls for national unity. He calls for integration, unification of the country, but basically his position was sort of to take over what was the beginnings of a nationalistic movement, calling for inclusion of all folks, but as a way of actually preventing the development of nationalistic movements among indigenous Africans. So I think he saw what the future was, and he tried to project himself into it in such a way that he can turn back the hands of time, or at least prevent the nationalistic movement from taking place among the indigenous Africans. So, and I think it was his political keenness that really allowed him to, I think he was successful in what he did, because it took a lot longer before the nationalistic ideas really would resurface again with the indigenous population.
On page 5 of the presentation, the last paragraph, say by 1917, the major threat from the local people were over. The last defeat of the whole confederation was decisive. From this period on, the hard feeling and animosity surfaced when the Lieutenant Brown immediately had 6 of his Sastan noblemen executed without cause or reason. The explanation later given was this: action was that because of the officer had asked for food supply and they were not forthcoming sufficiently quickly. In addition, the Sastan was burned by the frontier force. A total of 41 villages was burned, killing of 69 men, 45 women, and 27 children. After this incident, what was the government reaction?
There was no action on the part of the government in terms of investigating the incident or bringing justice to the individuals involved. There was no action whatsoever.
Now you talk about President Barclay.
Yes.
When he was forced to resign, and then the next person that took over refused to implement the recommendation of the League of Nations.
Mm-hmm.
Was there any basis for his refusal?
For refusal? Or the president, the guy who took over?
The government. And because former President Barclay resigned because of the implication of forced labor, and another president, the Secretary of State, took over as president of the country, but he refused to implement the recommendation.
Because the recommendation didn't really favor what the Americo-Liberians wanted to do in terms of their relationship and the kind of power and positions that they wanted to maintain. So basically, he sort of rescinded that. There's been a tradition of that when people have made commitments and then others would come in and simply say, well, I don't think that we should move in that direction. But there was, other than that, I didn't see any sources where reasons were given why he chose to do that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Dr. Holloway, I want to say thank you very much for adding your contribution to the historical issues that we are discussing. We want to say we appreciate it very highly. And thank you very much. Your recommendations, we take due note of them. We want to say thank you for coming from across the ocean to participate and make progress for this, our country. Thank you.
Testing. Thank you again, Dr. Holloway, for your presentation. I was really inspired by it. I have a couple of questions. I'd like to just get your comments on, basically, not so much questions, but just your in-depth insight into certain issues of concern. First of all, I was wondering, in your opinion, was there ever a shift from the settlers versus the native concept to a class problem for Liberia? Because, originally they started with two diverse groups coming together, a foreign element in the sense of those who saw themselves to be black, American, I don't know, as you specified, and having a different culture norm, meeting with their brothers here and clashing. But has that been continuous? Do you see any time where that shifted into more of a class activity, class problem, where there was intermarriage and identity, where people could feel, like, for example, Tubman, would he be considered Americo-Liberian? In as much as he was born here, he was bred here, his father and mother were born here and bred here. So could you share a little light on that? And why haven't we been able to overcome this old dichotomy in light of the modernization factor that you see that we're facing?
In a discussion. We got sound there. I had a discussion with Dr. Don, and he brought me to a certain new awareness of this, that in terms of this whole Americo-Liberian thing, that it's also a mentality. People who buy into that culture. But let me start by addressing what you asked earlier. In the beginning, when these groups looked very different, like the first group of settlers, most of them were all mulattoes, and they discriminated against many of the darker complected Americo-Liberians. And after about 50 years, most of them died out and interbred with other folk, and you had a homogeneous group at this point. Once the issue of color is no longer a factor in terms of who's an Americo-Liberian and who's not, then the issue of culture becomes paramount, because the problem is this: when people are of different races, different color tones, you have a basis and a foundation for discrimination on the basis of the way you look. But once you move towards a homogeneous group, color can never be an issue. So what happens at that point, it's class and culture that becomes an issue. And for the Americo-Liberians, the class and culture issues is being able to trace one ancestry back to the United States, back to the original ancestors and pioneers who had come over. So that becomes one of the more important bonds that hold this whole idea together. So you move from issues of color to issues of class, culture, and then in time, much later on, then a whole bunch of folk become a part of this community. Those who were brought into Americo-Liberian families, who adopted Americo-Liberian names, and who regarded themselves as Americo-Liberians, who picked up, the mentality, the ideology, and actually have, assumed an Americo-Liberian reality. So I think that was in the beginning, but then once you move towards having a homogeneous group, then that's culture, class becomes the foundation for holding that group together, because you can no longer look at color differences as a basis for discriminating against who's in and who's out, because now everybody pretty much looks the same. So class and culture at that point.
So then if that becomes true, then it seems that our biggest problem here is just man's inability to appreciate his fellow man. Somehow we tend to feel that one group is better than the other, whether it's because of money or whether it's because of education, etc. So as we are striving towards a unified Liberia, like now you talk about identity, what should be our new identity? It makes me wonder, because we have to go beyond. This new identity seems to have to be beyond Americo-Liberian or African. That can't be the factor anymore. It has to be beyond not rich, but it has to be beyond religious versus traditional, because these are natural factors. So somehow it would seem that this new identity has to be able to, we have to find for ourselves as a nation what is unique about Liberia and the resources and the peoples as a whole that is there that can make us stand out compared to another person. But I'm asking this question because I look at a family, you have different brothers and sisters in the same family. They all may have similar general natures and yet diversity. But yet what is beautiful is that each one has a unique talent, a unique capability. And when you emphasize the uniqueness of the capability, it overshadows the differences amongst them. So here we are trying to find a national identity. What can be that unifying factor amongst us all? And what can be the catalyst towards bringing it forward? These are the sort of thoughts that I would like for you to please share your thoughts on.
Well, I think one of the things that Liberians lack is a sense of national identity. What it is to be a Liberian, or what it is that makes a Liberian unique. But I think that definition has to be a discussion among Liberians to see what are the things that unite all the different diverse groups, bring them together into a consensus, if you will, a consensus of what makes them Liberians, and create the new Liberia that's based upon no longer Americo-Liberians, no longer the various African ethnicity, but Liberians first, and then whatever subgroup that you have. It's okay to maintain one's cultural identity into whatever your cultural group is, but all those different cultural groups got to have a single identity that ties them into being a Liberian. And I think that's something that Liberians have to work out in terms of looking at your history, your culture, the great diversity that you have, and drawing from that to see what are the things that can unite all of you and bring you together. One is language. That's why I suggest English is a language that is spoken. It's a way to be a unity language to bring everyone together, but I think there should also be a second indigenous African language that is taught along with English in the schools, so that you maintain this also an African identity, because language is one of the most important parts of culture that defines who an individual is. So, you're talking about English, I think you should talk about indigenous language, and, of course you guys will know better what language that can be used that will tie everybody together. History. You got to rewrite your history. You got to revise your history books. And those history books has to be inclusive of all the parts and pieces that make Liberia what it is in terms of all these various diverse groups. And it needs to be taught in the school, because this kind of building on national identity it's generational. You You have to build it into your school system. You have to build it into your educational system. You got the books that you write about your history, the textbooks that kids are taught. All that has to be a part of it. So it's a process. As you move on that path towards national identity. Now Tubman, he talked about national identity, but I think that his idea of national identity was to use that in such a way to maintain one particular group in the leadership role, and that group that has power, that would have power, but his idea I don't think was inclusive. So I think what needs to happen now, to revisit some of his ideas, because I think if you put a different twist on it, and talk about national unity, talk about a national identity, talk about unification of all Liberians, and do it in a constructive way, that you can begin that process of creating this national identity.
Could you give me an example, a model of a nation that you would say is a good example of a nation that has achieved a sort of national identity that we could reflect on?
Well, the closest country that I would say is that I have a lot of experience with is Ghana. In Ghana, you have several different groups. You got the Ashanti. You got the Fanti, that's closely related with language and culture, but still a lot of differences. And you have about 3-4 of the major groups. You got a lot of groups in the north. One of the things that hold all the Ghanaians together is that they teach English in the schools. So you got all these different diverse groups, even though they have their own language, their own culture, but also English is the thing that ties them together and allows them to communicate with each other. And everybody learns, and most of all the groups speak the language of the most dominant African group that you have there in terms of the Ashanti, Twi. So even though English is the official language, Twi is the unofficial language. And everyone speaks some form and kind of English for communicational purpose. In the house they will speak Twi, but that language factor brings them together, and the way their history is taught in the school also gives them a sense of national unity as being Ghanaians. And also I think it was the foresight of the first leader, Kwame Nkrumah, who also who understood that what he had was a collection of different nations, different peoples, different ethnicities. So he laid the institutional foundation for creating a national identity that will help to define all these different groups as being Ghanaians. As I travel all through Ghana, all these different groups, they tied into this idea of who they are as Ghanaians. Now, it's okay to have your own individual diversity, your own culture, but still it's the larger question of what defines a Ghanaian that makes a Ghanaian a Ghanaian. And I think because of what Kwame Nkrumah was able to do, contribute to that national identity. So I think Ghana is a prime example. When I was in Southern Africa, you had all these different African groups, mostly Bantu, languages that were very different. But what tied all of them together too was English, because in order for each of them to communicate with each other, it was English, but still they maintained their own individual identity, but they had a larger identity in terms of being South Africans, or as they told me, the new South African, because what apartheid tried to do was to use all the different diversity to keep all these different groups apart and scattered so that you wouldn't have this national identity. But all the groups did have something in common, which was to end apartheid and the struggle of how they've been victimized by the system. So actually, what it did, it actually united them. So I think South Africa will be a second example, but I think the best example that I have seen is what Ghana has been able to achieve.
Thank you. The last concern I had was this thing about the Pan-African concepts. In your opinion, looking back in our history, who would you say was the president that was more prone towards an African approach to Liberia's development in the sense of Pan-African harmonious spirit? And if so, do you see that as being productive towards the concept of African unity as we're looking at it right now?
I think Talbert was the president who felt it was important to move more towards an African identity for Liberians. And I'm not sure that he was successful at what he was trying to do, but I think he was moving in the right direction. Talbert did try to adopt a lot of the, he spoke an African language. He was the perfect example of how you begin this process of this national identity by being inclusive with the various different cultures and ethnicity. So I think Talbert can be revisited in terms of what he was trying to do and what his vision of a national unity is. But overall, I think it's Liberians going to have to define for themselves what that national identity should be and is going to be. It's a problem. And through hard work, through looking at some of the past ideas, well, actually, if you revisit what Tubman was trying to do with his national unity idea, his unification ideas, and look beyond how he was trying to use that for his own selfish purposes, you can take that as a basis and a foundation and take a new look at it, and you can build up on that as laying a foundation for this new Liberia that will be more inclusive and that will help and move towards creating this this national identity that Liberians can buy into, because it's important. If you can't define who you are as an African, as a Liberian, you don't have a good self-image of yourself. You don't. It does something to your psychological profile. It's these are the things that define you and your humanity, and I think that's what Liberians have to do. I think they have to wrestle with that and see what direction they want to move in, and what that identity is going to look like.
Okay, finally, my next thought comes to my mind as a historian, looking at the situation of history, how there was time where governance was centered on a spiritual value concept, and it was found that could not work. So they developed what they call the secular concept of democracy. And looking at how secular democracy has been struggling with the moral issue and the concept of a unified identity amongst its people, would you like to share some light or comments on that aspect? Because even here now in Liberia, we're just coming out of a situation of great difficulty, 20-something years, and we see that most of the people who could have made a difference were the leadership class. When I say leadership class, I mean beyond the political leaders, the religious leaders, academic leaders, etc. Those who had the opportunity, the know-how, the money, and the resources to set new paradigm shifts for their countries. That's what I call this leadership class. But yet, the total result so far, as the oldest independent country, has not been able to bring forth the kind of fruit we expected. Is it to be said that this is just a natural process of growth and development, or could there be a need for us to re-examine this spiritual element factor and get us back into more of a concept of the need for spiritual development in leadership, whereas people can come to see themselves as not responsible just for themselves and their parties or their groups, but for a larger whole? I don't know if you'd like to, say comment on that issue.
I think that spirituality is very important, and in terms of how the individual also defines himself and how a country defines itself. And one of the things I think is a starting point is Christians and Muslims should get together and should, go attend each other's services. develop a stronger relationship where you invite each other to come out to your sacred places and you do things together, because and I think that also would begin to create a better understanding between Christians and Muslims. I think this country, that the Christians and Muslims do not do enough together, and sometimes I think they talk past each other, but that's a start. And looking at some of the other issues, what was the other part of your question?
Would there be a need for a new shift of thinking with regards to preparing leaders in the new realm that we're coming into, this globalization concept? Should these leaders have a more spiritual preparation factor, or should we just continue with this secular concept, separating the two and just hoping that there will be some filtering into the leadership realm?
Well, I think religion can serve as a foundation for helping the new leader, because I think new leaders, they should be moral, they should be spiritual, because I think that does a lot for one's humanity. And I think the Christians, the Muslims can do a lot of more developmental things to prepare people for leadership positions, and that's why I was suggesting that I think that there should be more cooperation between Christians and Muslims in this country. There should be programs for development of leadership at the same time that you're dealing with spiritual issues. But also, I think when you're dealing with spiritual issues and creating a moral background for political leaders, that Muslims and Christians should talk to each other too.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Holloway. I want to ask 3 questions. They are meant to provoke your innermost thoughts on these issues we are now discussing. The first has to do with the settlers and their capacity to lead democratically as we may have expected. Was it possible that the settlers could have done better, considering that all they inherited was a plantation mentality, and just as they set foot on the soil of Liberia, there was hostilities, and that continued for a protracted period. Under those circumstances and with that mindset, can we still expect that better should have come out of them, considering the whole backgrounds there?
Well, I think they were doomed from the start, because they brought too much culture baggage with them from America. Part of the problem is this: if you have been an enslaved person and you've been raised in a society based on slavery, the only thing that you see is the power and the authority of the slave master. And people who have been oppressed aspire to be like the oppressor. They want to look like them, they want to talk like them, they want to walk like them, they want to have the power and the influence that they have. And once you reach a position of power, you treat others the way you have been treated, because that's all you know. And when you look at other settlers community throughout the world, you see the same kind of problems popping up with the Dutch when they came to South Africa, and the kind of society they created and what happened there. The issues in Palestine with the settler community coming in after World War II, and the kind of issues you have there. What happened with the Americo-Liberians coming in, because people, when they come in from different places, they bring those cultural baggage with them. Now, what are the cultural baggages? Southern mentality, slavery, classism, racism, and all those things. Because I think in a book I did on Liberia called Liberian Diplomacy in Africa, I have a chapter where I compare Southern American society with Liberian society, and I try to mirror the societies together. And what you have here were basically Southern institutions. But the problem with that is this. It wasn't the Southern institutions as they actually existed, but it was only the image of what the new person coming into America had of those old institutions. And at best, it was a warped conception of what he thought was going on in America, and then tries to transplant that reality here in the heart of Africa, and then to try to make everything else conform with his view of what this new world should look like based upon those old Southern institutions. And there lies the problem, because the institutions as they existed in the South were set up to prevent intermixing of the races and groups, to keep them apart, one group exploitation being exporting another group, and to maintain status quo. So if you have that as your foundational founding kind of ideas and Southern mentality, you're doomed from the start, because you got to get out of that box, and you got to create a new box or a new paradigm that will allow you to see the new reality that you are in, and create a new reality that's more inclusive, and that brings all people together, instead of putting up barriers and fences and walls and dividing people from each other based upon, in this case, culture, class, and ethnicities.
Thank you. You referenced a white man's solution to a black man's problem in your presentation. And I was trying to understand the black man's problem and the white man's solution to that problem. Considering that, I would be inclined to ask if there were structural problems that blacks should have been escaping or running away from, other than just slavery. If the blacks returned to Africa and on these shows voluntarily, and if those problems were so well structured to inhibit all the values they had imagined at the time, why wasn't there a mass movement, as Garvey and others have advocated? Why wasn't there a mass movement towards Liberia or even Sierra Leone?
Well, even with Garvey, when he sent his delegation here, it is said that I believe it was President King that he had given at least $15 million to come up to establish his various settlements on key places that were rivers, areas that were neighboring other African countries, because Garvey had a larger plan of wanting to create his United States of Africa, starting with Ghana. Many people think that the idea of the United States of Africa starts with Kwame Nkrumah, but actually it was Garvey who had this vision and saw himself as this provisional president of Africa. He gives King some money. The U.S. sends Du Bois, of all people, who is a Pan-Africanist, to come, I think it was in 1921, and met with the president, and he was given a special title as envoy extraordinaire or something like that. But they made Du Bois pay his own trip to come here. But he had so much hatred towards Garvey that he paid. But I think, even though they were both Pan-Africanists, the issue and the problem that Du Bois had with Garvey was this color issue. Light versus dark, which had been a serious issue in terms of colorism in America, and how black people have discriminated against each other on the basis of color. Light against the dark, dark against the light, and so forth. And here, this man who he regarded as this uneducated person comes and takes his position on the world stage, and actually, the only time that you really had the opportunity for this Pan-African movement to take off was with Garvey, and yet another Pan-Africanist got here before he did, and they wouldn't even let Garvey's delegation off the boat. They gave him 24 hours to get out of town, and then cut a deal with the Firestone Company, which gave away all that land for virtually nothing, with the promise that Firestone would build all these roads, bridges, hospitals, and schools. They did build some of those things, but it was for only people who worked on their plantation. So Liberians still didn't get what they were supposed to get, but this was something that Du Bois did to help with this negotiation on the part of an American company. I think in terms of the Pan-African issue, what was the second part of your question? I can't think of the other one, and then that would tie me back into what I was saying. You asked a question about Pan-Africanism, and what's the other part?
Yeah, what may have inhibited free slaves from coming down to Africa in mass?
In mass?
Considering that maybe there were structural problems they had.
Well, see, the problem is this. You had several black Americans who wanted to make a connection with Liberia in terms of having this mass exodus, okay? And the problem was they wanted to bring people who had the kind of abilities and expertise that can help in nation building, okay? That's the people who are at the top. But the people who were willing to come were the people who had no stake in American society, were the people who were at the bottom and who had no resources. And when Turner, Bishop Henry McNeill Turner, tried to get this massive immigration going on with blacks coming back to Liberia, he targeted that class. That class was not willing to go anywhere because that class of black people were doing well in America. You know, they had money, they had resources, and he wasn't talking to the poor people because he thought they had nothing to offer. So in many cases, the people who are trying to organize the Back to Africa movement, they're talking to the wrong people. They're talking to the top of the class that are not going nowhere because they're satisfied. They got money and resources, when it's the bottom of the class who have no stake and who are willing to get up, relocate, and start a new life in a new place.
Thank you.
Welcome.
I'd like to talk about language, common identity, and unity. You suggested that, yes, English seems to be spoken by all Liberians, and we should maintain that and popularize another indigenous language. The first question that comes to mind is, what sort of standards can we establish, taking into consideration that all of the 16 tribes or languages are spoken are highly competitive groups, and you want to avoid elevating any one of them above the other. This debate has been around, however subtle it was, but people have been thinking about it. The moment it comes to which of the spoken language we want to elevate in our status, and everybody avoid the argument. Are there safeguards? Are there high points and low points we have to consider in trying to arrive at this decision? Is there any standard? Is there any criteria you want to advance that we could consider?
Why not have one of the language that you have, that first African language that has a written script? I believe it's Vai. You can say have Vai as a secondary language, but you also, all the groups will still maintain their own languages and the language identity that language gives them. Well, all you're doing is simply elevating an African language to the position of English. Now, there was a president, Nyerere, who tried to, what he did, English was spoken in this country, and then he tried to elevate Swahili. as a way of unifying all the very different African groups who spoke different languages. But they still, they still got their own different languages. English is still an official language, but everybody speaks of Swahili. So it can be something maybe like on that model, But you don't turn off the other groups because you're not saying that they cannot use their language. You're just simply saying that while English is the national language for communication because, it helps to unify all groups, we're simply going to elevate an African language, to that same level as a way of this process of, let's call it Africanization. Or should we say Africanization of Liberians? It's kind of hard to say that since, you guys are Africans, right? Anyway, it's just a joke. Don't take me serious. But something like that, what's the largest ethnic group that you have here?
Well, it's difficult to speak empirically now. The census has been conducted, we don't know.
Okay.
But I know you have Pele,
somebody said Pele, okay.
Yeah.
Maybe start with the largest ethnic group that speaks a particular language and bring that to a level. It doesn't have to be Vai, it can be Pele. But I think what has to happen, I think it's a discussion that Liberians would need to have and come up with his own solution given what realities that's on the ground, because it can be quite a political situation in terms of you select one culture group over another culture group and problems that can cause. But you might want to start with the largest group, because then I think you'll have less problems with elevating that language because you have more speakers of that language. But I think at some point there has to be this process of Africanization, and the best way I think you can do that is having two languages, English and an African language, and everyone will learn that in school. When they go to school, to the primary schools, they learn English and Pele, or they learn English and Vai. And that becomes the language that ties everybody together, and that becomes the language that helps making this contribution towards this national identity, because language is probably one of the most important parts of what defines what a culture is for people. And it's also what's important for helping that individual to define what their humanity is based upon the way you speak and what you speak.
Thank you very much, Dr. Holloway.
Thank you.
We want to, at this time, express to you again our gratitude for coming and joining us. Our presentation has just ended as we have exhausted our questions. We want to thank you very much for being patient in taking our questions, and at the same time for the several wide-ranging recommendations you've advanced to the Commission. We trust that you have contributed immensely to our work. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Hearing Officer, we're joined today and resume tomorrow, and Dr. Done.